It always seems like there's at least 26 different ways of hosting anything on Azure, and that's no different with SQL Server. I can think of at least 3 different ways of hosting SQL Server on Azure. But which one should we choose? Let's mash on that. Hi everybody and welcome to another episode of the Asp.Net Monsters. In today's episode, we are going to talk a little bit about picking the SQL hosting option on Azure. So there's a couple of options here that we could have.
I'm surprised it's only 3. I expected more than that.
3 is what I'm thinking of kind of at the moment in terms of ways of hosting it. I'm sure there's an infinity of other ways too. Like that, I haven't done anything like, oh, you could host it on Kubernetes, that sort of thing, or inside of a container. This is kind of like the 3 main options, I think, for hosting this. So the ones that I have been looking at are kind of using the Scott Hanselman approach of talking about this, is that we've got like the taxi where Azure is going to take care of a bunch of stuff for you. You don't have to worry about changing tires. You don't have to worry about oil. You just give it some money and it'll give you a SQL server. So that is the SQL Azure approach. There is a slightly more customized version where you go and you rent the car yourself and you've got to drive it. And you're responsible for putting gas in most of the time, unless you want to pay exorbitant prices when you return it. And that is managed SQL, so SQL managed instances. And then the final one is where you go out and buy your own vehicle, and then you're responsible for maintaining it and gassing it and doing all the maintenance and all of those sorts of things on it. And that is SQL Server on a virtual machine. So just by default, I try and push people towards using the taxi approach. So that's the SQL Azure approach. But I have found in the last couple of years that there have been some cases where I've been doing migrations of people to Azure and it hasn't worked out for us to use SQL Azure because there's just like a missing feature or some little problem in there that we need to move to a more managed solution to address. So I sat down and I came up with a bunch of questions that I can ask people now when we have these initial meetings about migrating their database. That gives me a hint as to which one of the options we should go for. Now, this isn't like an exhaustive list or anything like that, but it does give some pointers for what you might want to use.
Hoping for a flowchart here, Simon.
I don't have. I mean, I guess I could make a flowchart. Maybe I'll add a flowchart here. I just have like a bunch of questions where if you answer yes to any of the first 3, you move over. So the first question that I ask people is, does your solution use any sort of cross-database joins? So what I'm looking for there is you've got 2 databases and you're joining tables together between those 2 databases in some sort of a query. So that is possible on SQL Azure, but it is difficult to do. You need to use Elastic Query for it. So I spent a little bit of time playing with that, and for any sort of large size project, especially one that uses like stored procedures and those sorts of things, doing these joins is tricky. It's a slightly different syntax, so getting it to work is difficult, and you're probably better off moving away from that. So
I think you did an episode on that, Simon. Maybe
yeah,
we can link that in the show notes.
I think I did too, probably about a year ago. So yeah, we'll dig that one up and link to that in the show notes. So the other one is, are you using any sort of SQL agent to run jobs? So there's no direct support for SQL agent on on Azure SQL. There is a service called Elastic Jobs, which can be used to substitute him for that. But again, you've got to go through and rewrite all of your stuff to work inside of Elastic Jobs. So for a sizable project, it's probably not worth the effort of going through doing that. And you're going to have to move over to the next level up, which is managed instances. And then the next one is, are you using FileStream anywhere to access resources on disk? So there's no kind of direct disk analogy for SQL Azure, so that means that you can't really use a file stream to get access to files. So if any of those first three questions you've answered yes to, and you're not prepared to do some redesign on your solution, then you probably need to move up to managed instances. So managed instances are a slightly more, or slightly closer solution to what you'd end up with on-premise SQL. So it's almost pin compatible with on-premise SQL, but there's still a few things missing. So you do get access now to doing cross-database joins. That's no problem. You can use SQL Agent on it, and you can use file streams, although they are backed by blob storage as opposed to like local on-disk storage. So the kind of the disadvantages to this managed instances approach is that it is a lot slower to spin up. So a SQL Azure database will spin up inside of, I don't know, 2 minutes probably. A managed instance can take up to 24 hours. I have often had problems with it inside of something like Terraform, where I go to spin it up and it takes so long to spin up that the Terraform process times out. So it's difficult to do any sort of like infrastructure as code using one of these databases because it is so slow to spin up, especially for very large instances. So the instance that I was working with was, I think, 24 cores or something. So that took quite a while for it to spin up and get going. But it's pretty good. I mean, it hits most of the major points of those first three, and you can use that here. So the final one is to move over to your own SQL Server instance on a virtual machine. So there are some shortcuts for installing Visual Studio and licensing Visual Studio through virtual machines. And that's very useful, but you're still going to have to manage like OS updates and patching and all of that stuff by yourself. So I try to avoid this if possible, but there are some places still where you might need to fall into it and use it. So for instance, if you need to fine tune any sort of availability groups, then although there are availability groups in the two lower levels here, or the two more managed instances here, you're not going to be able to fine tune them perhaps to the degree that you want to. So for that, you might need to use virtual machines or multiple virtual machines. Do you need to log into your SQL Server instance using certificates, asymmetric keys, or SIDs? If so, then you're on the virtual machines. Managed instances don't support those styles of logins. They're really pushing people towards Active Directory logins, which I think makes a lot of sense. Do you need to make use of a compatibility level below 100? So each edition of SQL Server has its own compatibility level for it. I forget what the mapping is, but like SQL Server 2016 is like compatibility level 13 or something like that, or 130 rather. So if you need to go back in time to have your database run as if it was a much older version of the database, using a different version of the database engine, you're limited to version 100 on managed instances, so you need to go to a virtual machine for that. If you need to do advanced kind of database mirroring stuff, so this is similar to availability stuff, you're going to be on the virtual machines again. Do you need to be able to start and stop job scheduling? So while there is SQL agent job scheduling on managed instances, you cannot stop it and restart it. So if you want to like pause it while you do some work on the database and then restart it, that's not possible to do. You need to go down to a virtual machine for that. Are you making use of SQL Server reporting services? Ideally, you shouldn't be anymore. I don't know if it's really a supported product anymore. I think it's still technically supported, but kind of the way that Microsoft is driving people is towards Power BI. So if you need to use SQL Server reporting services, then you're going to need to install that on your own virtual machine. There used to be, some years ago, a managed version of SSRS, but that has long since been removed. It's one of only maybe like 3 services I can think of that have been sunsetted on Azure. I mean, most of the time the stuff is still there. Like you can still spin up new, what were those things called? Compute jobs?
Cloud services.
That's the one, yeah. From right in the beginning of time.
One of the original services.
Mm-hmm. And then the final one is, are you using XP command shell anywhere inside of your application? So this is like calling out to execute processes on the server itself, which feels like bad practice to me, but bad practice and reality are sometimes strange bedfellows. So if you're doing anything with that, then you need to go down to a virtual machine again. But yeah, I try and drive people kind of more towards the taxi side here. But if you really need to move up, if you've answered yes to any of these questions, then there are other options available to you on Azure. So I have written this down in a blog post. I will probably expand on that now that you've mentioned it with a flow chart, and we can get this out for people to take a look at.
That's great. Thanks, Simon.
Yeah.
These options more towards the right, where you're dealing with like the VM and having to manage SQL Server all on your own. It sounds like you're describing more scenarios where you have like a large existing application that was built using SQL Server maybe quite a few years ago and is leveraging a lot of the native features of it that you're probably going to have, you hopefully already have that expertise on your team, but you're going to need somebody on your team who knows how to manage SQL Server, like a real DBA. Whereas the option where you have more managed things feels more like maybe a cloud native application, for lack of a better word, but something that was more designed with the cloud in mind as opposed to on-premise resources.
Yeah, definitely. The people who really know SQL are few and far between in my experience. I'm always overjoyed when I run into somebody who really knows it.
Yeah, same.
Because it's not me. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us on today's episode. Remember to like, comment, and share. And we will see everybody next week.
Bye.
All right.